Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the daily chart of the Chinese currency versus the US dollar. I pointed out recently this little uptick that we had here. This is the USD/CNY, and the way you read those, let's pull out to the weekly. The way you read those is that the first currency in that cross, if the chart's going down, that means that currency is getting weaker. So this is the weakening of the US dollar versus the Chinese currency. You can see that it's a very steady decline, although we have this recent uptick. Now, I do not expect this recent uptick to continue, but I expect that this downtrend to resume. You'll see in the stories that we cover here in a bit the reason for that, but we've seen some calls recently from US authorities indicating that the Chinese are manipulating their currency again. That's because of this uptick, but I fully expect that we will head to 1-to-1 and beyond in the not too distant future. Now let's jump over and look at the action in the gold and silver markets, because it's kind of crazy. We have a continuation of that smackdown that we had. You can see here on the opening, the aftermarket opening, we got a big sell-off. Now, I pointed out in charts on the membership site, here in gold, we had this unprecedented amount here. You can see that 50,000 plus contracts. We're talking $5, $6, $7 billion worth of paper money thrown at the market. Much smaller amount here in the after hours. Nevertheless, they are doing what they do best, and that is manipulating markets, corruption, and crime. And that's what the US and British authorities do. Now, the dramatic drop in silver, you can see the volume. I posted a chart talking about 2 times world daily mining supply was sold in a 5-minute time frame. That occurred back here. Now you can see a continuation in the after hours. So the cartel is out in full force. As some had speculated, maybe they had given up. They apparently have not given up. So now it's time to attack again, and we'll see if they can push it down. I strongly doubt they could push it down, but you can see this is a big surge in volume. Same thing with gold, but not quite as dramatic. We don't have all the volume figures there. So the cartel has not given up. The cartel is still attacking silver and gold with tremendous amounts of paper contracts selling gold and silver that doesn't exist. Ultimately, they're going to be caught red-handed, and we're going to see that they're not going to have any gold. Now, this story from In Gold We Trust, I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but this is an attempt to try to account for and understand this Chinese gold demand and what we're talking about when we talk about deliveries and withdrawals from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. You can see this is SGE withdrawals. You've got world mining production, SGE withdrawals, and COMEX physical delivery. Of course, COMEX physical delivery is utterly dwarfed by these others. You can see, for example, there's a year here, December 2011, it looks like, where it actually was a significant number, but you can see the trend is that it's declining. It's not significant. And then you can see the steady rise in world mine production. We know that one of the reasons why gold is money and is favored as money worldwide throughout history is because there's so much of it out there. It's never destroyed. It's always, once it's mined, it's always saved and hoarded. And that means there's a lot of it, relatively speaking. From a historical perspective, all the gold that has ever been mined, we pretty much have. What that means is that the impact of a year's mining of gold is not very large because there's such a large amount outstanding. Roughly, I've heard anywhere from 1 to 3% is added to that. That makes gold a very, very stable money. Now, silver isn't that, and that's intentional. The reason that silver isn't that is because they've intentionally caused a shortage of silver by underpricing it, which causes it to not be recycled, not be stockpiled, but used up. And that's an intentional effort to demonetize silver. So you can see here that this incredible amount of SGE withdrawals is now starting to rival world mine supply, world mine production. So how can we account for that? The author tries to account for that, and I encourage you to go through these charts and the article. You can see here's one on SGE withdrawals, and they're just absolutely exploding. Fascinating charts. Here's another one. Here's weekly gold withdrawn from Shanghai Gold Exchange vaults. And again, that's just phenomenal amount there compared to even just back in 2009 and 2010. You can see it's ramping up to endgame very, very clearly. So I encourage you to read this article. It's fascinating analysis. But I wanted to look at what's going on in China, because what's going on in China is not what you're being told. Now, we've had recent reports on the Chinese trade deficit, and China for February actually reported trade deficit. This is something that's to be expected. In fact, if we were expecting the Chinese to move forward in a future growth strategy, we would expect to see that sort of move as China begins to turn inward and sell the goods that they have historically been exporting to the West, begin to sell those goods to domestic markets. That makes perfect sense. So let's look at some of the stories about China and the fact that it isn't slowing down at all, and how China, in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion, but China seems to be doing all the right things while America and the EU seem to be doing all the wrong things. Here's an article from New York Times. China announces a 12.2% increase in its military budget. Now, I said for quite some time that China is going to start floating aircraft carriers. There's no reason to believe that the West really has anything that the Chinese don't. And that's been a type of hubris that we've seen in the West for a very, very long time, that the Chinese are just copycats. There's some truth to that, but now when we have most of our high technology coming out of China, it's ridiculous to believe that China is not going to be able to create a massive military. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Beijing, China announced on Wednesday that it would increase its military budget for 2014 to almost $132 billion, or a 12.2% rise over last year. Now, that may not seem a lot when you look at the Pentagon's budget and you look at the alleged black budgets, but if you look at the growth and you think about the percentage of the economy, and you think about this military growth is actually sustainable, whereas what's going on in the United States is not sustainable at all. If China continues to grow its military at 12.2%, then of course it's going to have the largest military in the world, and a sustainable military probably within the next 10 years. Now, this is a fascinating news article. This is from FT. This came out today. Why China's leaders love to watch House of Cards. The Netflix show's depiction of U.S. corruption confirms Chinese perceptions, says Kurt Campbell. If articles in the China-watching press are to be believed, we have recently learned a lot about the viewing habits of senior Chinese leaders. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, reportedly considers the American classic The Godfather his favorite Western cinematic indulgence. Wang Qishan, the former vice premier of finance and now ultimate arbiter for discipline on the Communist Party's standing committee, is said to favor House of Cards. Mr. Wang has purportedly told colleagues in Zongnanhai, the cloistered leadership compound, to keep abreast of the Netflix hit. He apparently was so transfixed by early episodes that he instructed underlings to check the release date for Season 2. Political heavyweights from authoritarian regimes tend to favor muscular U.S. movies such as Rambo and Scarface. Apparently, the Latin American strongman Manuel Noriega had a library filled with violent American VHS videotapes. But when the members of the Chinese political class are asked about their American cinema favorites, it is movies about official corruption, political double-crossing, and state violence that are most often mentioned. This Western programming is complemented by a range of Chinese-produced shows whose plot lines resemble the twists and turns of Dallas, the 1980 show that followed the family feuds unfolding inside a fictitious Texas oil dynasty. Indeed, a number of Western actors in China have found a niche, playing roles as corrupt politicians, warmongering military officers, or seductive female executives on the prowl. What lies behind this fascination with political intrigue? It is possible that the Chinese view the portrayal of politics in House of Cards as quintessentially American, perhaps even an accurate depiction of the workings of the U.S. government. Now let me say, we've been watching House of Cards recently from the beginning and seen about 7 episodes. I would have to say from watching that is an understatement of the corruption that goes on in Washington. But of course the American show is adapted from a BBC series from 1990s, blah, 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 blah. So they're going to try to tell you that House of Cards isn't accurate. I can tell you, after watching House of Cards, that I'm sure a lot more underhanded things are going on, and there's a lot of things that House of Cards hints at, such as mind control and sexual blackmail, that I'm sure that there is much, much more going on than what is hinted at in House of Cards. Now, here's an interesting article. Again, New York Times. Red lights dim in China's Sin City. Dongguan, China. His cell phone is not ringing. His online chat program sit idle. His condoms stay wrapped. People are no longer approaching Denny to pay for sex. In Dongguan, we have something called Dongguan-style service. The young man with dyed brown hair said as he sat in a hotel restaurant, agreeing to speak on the condition that only his English nickname be used. Now it's all stopped, he said. China is undergoing the harshest anti-vice campaign the government has mounted in years. And the crackdown is taking its toll on the economy of Dongguan, a southern city of more than 8 million people. It is a manufacturing center for the export business and a mecca for migrant workers, but is also the nation's Sin City. Now the red light industry here is blushing in deep pink. Nightclubs and massage parlors, whether in 5-star hotels or shadowy alleys, have been shuttered. Taxi drivers who once thrived on commissions from brothels are grappling with shrinking wallets. Some landlords are having a hard time renting out apartments as prostitutes leave town or decide not to return from Lunar New Year vacations. So severe is the crackdown and so large is the sex industry in Dongguan that police officials in nearby Hong Kong have expressed worries about a flood of potential displaced prostitutes arriving there. The campaign appears to be the latest element in a broad push by President Xi Jinping, the chief of the Communist Party, to expunge the image of corruption associated with Chinese officials. So the Chinese, and we've just seen recently that the Chinese are now allowing a corporate bond default. Of course, people in the West are saying that that's going to mark the beginning of the collapse of the financial system there. I think it's quite the opposite. I think the Chinese have probably learned the American lesson that you don't bail out the corrupt entities, but you let them go under. And the last article, this is People Daily. China's education reform draws applause, advice worldwide. Premier Li Keqiang has stressed recently that China would strive to balance the distribution of educational resources properly, reform the entrance exam approach, and accelerate the building of an employment-oriented modern vocational education system to boost education quality and fairness. China's educational reforms laid out in the government work report at the ongoing annual session of China's top legislature has drawn wide applause and helpful advice from education experts and professionals worldwide. What impresses you the most about China's education and Chinese students? Asked Xinhua. What advantages and problems do you think China has in education? Quote, what impresses me most is that Chinese students are well organized and disciplined. We should learn from them, said Mariana Escalante, a lecturer on Chinese language at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Quote, when I was studying at Peking University, I found their capabilities in memorizing textbook knowledge are mind-blowing. I even wondered whether they were born with special abilities, she added. So there you go. There's Chinese schools. So we've got, and we already know that American schools are absolute garbage. We've got illiteracy rates through the roof. People who can't even read in these educational systems of the big cities of America. Absolutely crumbling education system. So China is properly boosting its education system. It's cracking down on its red light district. It's allowing bonds to go into default. It is laughing at the corruption in Washington. It is building its military, and it is importing more and more gold. So you tell me, the writing is on the walls right now. The real house of cards is the United States, and it's going to collapse very, very soon. And we'll talk to you next time.